to be doing this, introduction, and also welcoming Mr. Sanyal. It's extremely difficult to come across a person who's so well-rounded, somebody who's so talented across any sphere that he chooses to, hold forth. Somebody who's very well versed in history, somebody who's well versed in literature, somebody who's an economist. So trust me, sir, many of my NITIE students follow you on Facebook. So you have a very huge fan following there. All of us, a lot of us. And it's a pride, pleasure, privilege to be welcoming you here to address the students. We there are a lot of questions to students. We are talking of Atmanirbhar, we are talking of green shoots post Covid-19, we are talking of the kind of packages that we've been receiving through the government of India. So we would like to hear from you. So I don't want to stay between you and the students. So I'll just briefly tell you that the session is going to be for about 30 minutes, which will be followed by a very, very enthusiastic question and answer session. So we are going to really regulate that, but we have number of questions for you. So I just welcome you to the session. I once again express my gratitude on behalf of NITIE and sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
We can hear.
So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak to all of you at NITIE, and I believe this is the first lecture, so it is a particular honor to be able to do this. Now, the question is, you're all management students, so what do I speak to you about on your very first lecture? So I decided that I'm going to use the current global economic crisis as a way to take you through the thinking process that people who are managing large systems, including the economy, have to manage and take decisions as things evolve. This is actually useful for some people like you to understand, because it will give you a flavor of the kinds of thoughts that go through our mind as we take decisions. In a few years' time, you will be taking these decisions, and maybe you will understand where we are coming from. I'm sure you'll do a better job than we are, but at least hopefully you will understand why we did what we did, and you learn from our experience, just like we have learned from that of those who came before us. So the key thing to understand about the many steps we take right now is to understand that we are in a peculiar environment which is quite unprecedented, at least for several generations. So since the Great Depression and the Second World War, the world economy has not seen such a large shift, such a large shock. So in terms of anybody who is currently in the decision-making space in India today, this is, or for that matter, anywhere in the world, this is completely unprecedented. So how do we take decisions in an environment where our personal experiences do not really help us? This is also an environment where the future is very, very uncertain. Even the present is very, very uncertain. So how do you take decisions which will influence hundreds of millions of people when you do not know exactly what is going on? You have incomplete information, you have an evolving situation, and the future is very, very uncertain, not just in India, but globally. So how do you take decisions in that environment? So what I'm going to try and do is talk about the thinking process that goes into making decisions in this environment. It will then be a way to explain the kinds of decisions we took so that you understand where we are coming from. So rather than give you a long list of decisions we took, which you anyway know about, anyway read about them in newspapers or from other lectures I've given, you will understand how taking decisions in a very uncertain environment goes. This is basically true both of the decisions we took on the economic front, but also, by the way, true of the decisions we have taken on the health front, where we also have the same problem of making decisions while we are in an evolving, uncertain environment. And you'll see there are clear parallels between the two. So let's step back to March, the middle of March, and what information do we have? The information we have at that time is the following: that something pretty nasty had happened in China. We were not sure what exactly had happened because information was not entirely clear. By the way, it's still not very clear. And we also knew that whatever had happened had now spread to Italy and had begun to kill a lot of people. It also seemed to be spreading to other countries, including India. So that is, by and large, the sum total of the information we had. We didn't know what the nature of that particular disease was and what that virus was doing, how dangerous it was, who were the categories of people it was most dangerous for. We really didn't know very much about it. So what do you do in that environment? Well, the obvious thing to do, first thing, you call a bunch of experts and ask them, what is it that you think we should do? But the experts, as we will remember from that time, gave us a very wide range of things that were possible. So there was one group of virus experts, virologists, who had these extrapolations, which suggested that by June, hundreds of millions, 300 million Indians would have it. There would be literally lakhs of people dying and so on. So there was that on one end. And then there were others who said, look, it's perhaps a little bit of it's more dangerous than a normal flu, but maybe not much more. So it's a bad flu, and there were many things in between. And so the advice you got were also similarly very varied. You had people who said, oh, let's do a complete lockdown. This is the end of the world. And there were others who said, let's go for herd immunity. By the way, this is not too different from the kinds of feedback other governments also got. And you saw, for example, the UK went initially for a herd immunity option and changed its mind. Sweden did well known, the Swedish model. The Germans did something somewhat different. There were countries who went for lockdown like ourselves. There was Singapore, which went one way and then went the other way, and so on and so forth. So you clearly had very little information and it was evolving. So what does a country like India do? Now, clearly, like Singapore, we can't opt one way and change because we are 1.3 billion people. And once we have taken a particular direction, we are basically stuck with it. So what is the decision that you can take that you know you can stick with and make sense in that environment? Well, one option, which is the one we opted for, is something called the barbell strategy. Those of you who will learn finance or may be aware of this, studied finance, may be aware of the barbell strategy. But even if you don't, it's actually not a very complicated thing. The idea is basically the following, that in a barbell, you basically you do a mixed strategy. On one hand, you hedge for the very worst possible outcomes. And on the other side, you basically respond as things play themselves out. So on one side, you hedge for the very worst outcome, and you basically step by step respond on the other side as things evolve. So this is precisely what we did. If you will remember that around about 20th of March or thereabouts, we opted for a full lockdown. This is basically an attempt to hedge out the very worst. Now, it's not the case that we thought that first initial 3-week lockdown would solve everything, but it did mean that we gave us time to understand what it was, put in place some quarantining and testing facilities, gave time to see how things were evolving in other countries where things had progressed further than us, and essentially buy ourselves time while containing to the extent we could through a full lockdown. Now, we knew that a full lockdown can't be sustained for a long period of time for obvious reasons. The economic and human costs are just too high, but it bought ourselves time. Then we began to put in place the second part of the barbell, which is over time we began to gingerly open things up. So initially very, very slowly, and then over time we began to open things up as we got more and more information about what the nature of disease is, we figured out, for example, it may not be as dangerous, maybe the worst kinds of forecasts were, but it's clearly very, very dangerous for certain demographic groups. It gave us some sense, like, for example, use of masks seems to be something that helps mitigate it. So over time, that got spread out. We were, as a result, similarly be able to put in place testing methods and so on. Now, this explains to you why is it that today, when we have lots more cases, why are we opening things up when we were willing to shut everything down in March when we had very few cases? Well, there you have the answer. It's a barbell strategy. You hedge for the worst, and once you have a sense of what is it you're dealing with, you are able to make sensible trade-offs, which is what we are doing now. It's not that the problem has gone away, but we can now make trade-offs because we have some sense of what this disease is. We have some ways of dealing with it. We know we need certain kinds of ventilators. We have some sense of the kinds of symptoms. And of course, there is testing and other things in place. And of course, longer term, we have vaccines and other things now being built out as well. So this is why we took the decisions the way we did. It will also give you a sense of the kind of decisions we will make in the future. Now, let me shift to the kinds of decisions we took on the economic front. Here again, when we did the lockdown, we knew that this is a very severe thing. You are actually shutting down the economy. It's not just, and you're shutting, there is all kinds of things that will get disrupted. So there again, we have to know there are few things. We are also dealing with total uncertainty. We don't know how long this will last. We have no clear idea of how this will pan out globally because it's not just an Indian problem. Worldwide, this is happening. So there's an impact on imports and exports, oil prices, all kinds of things. There's impact on the exchange rate, capital flows, and all of these are evolving. And of course, the shutdown itself causes all kinds of breakdowns in supply chains inside India. So what do you do? Well, the first thing you do, again, the barbell strategy, you basically create cushions for the very worst outcomes. Now, this does not solve the longer term problems, which you have to deal with on a step-by-step basis. But at the short run, you basically cushion for the worst. So this is what we did. We realized that, there is one section of the population that actually won't have enough food. So it may not have any cash as well. So we used various mechanisms we had put in place, thankfully, in the previous few years, and we were able to transfer some money into people's bank accounts, or Jan-Dhan accounts, and so on. This is not going to solve poverty or bring back demand and so on. No, this is not going to reflate the economy. This is just a cushion. Same thing we did by making sure food was available. And that has over time, of course, been extended right up to November. Essentially, 800 million people have access to free food up to a certain extent. This is unprecedented in world history. I can assure you the sheer scale of it. But we were able to do it and are continuing to do it, and we'll have that in place till November as the Prime Minister promised. We also made sure that cooking gas was made available as well. So at least people have some food. Now, same thing is being done for the corporate sector. There were a whole bunch of financial deadlines that were looming because this is March end. So we pushed those deadlines back. And I think now, 1st to June, now further out for some of these deadlines are as far as November in some cases. So you got those deadlines out of the way. So again, buying yourself time. We put in some sort of a moratorium because we know people may not be able to make payments, etc. So there is a moratorium in place. Again, all of it is cushioning. When we got a little more time, we then began to get a response from the Reserve Bank. It began to lower interest rates and then try and transmit it. We recognized that there were, for example, there might be cascades of defaults that could happen. So hence the moratorium, but we also put in place a 100% guarantee for MSME loans because we realized that MSMEs may not have the cash to simply survive. There's no point in reflating the economy later on when you've already destroyed your productive capacity. So you have to keep that productive capacity, those companies alive to the other side of this cycle. How do you do that? Well, at least make sure that they have enough credit. So hence a 100% guarantee was given of 3 lakh crores of money made available through the banking system. Similarly, you know that not everybody takes money from the banks. There is NBFCs and other ways they get money. So a special purpose vehicle has been created. Some money has been given, 30,000 crores or thereabouts, so that this money can be used as a buyer of last resort of bonds and other instruments that NBFCs are unable to sell because of dislocated financial markets. We also recognize that people may not be able to leverage if you don't have your basic equity in there. So a system of sub-debt has been created such that, sub-debt can be taken on and that sub-debt can be utilized in order to go ahead and begin to raise money. So you can leverage that money up. So another kind of funding has been created for that. The basic idea here is, again, notice all of this is aimed towards providing a cushion through this cycle. We recognize that this does not mean that we are going to be able to reflate the economy using this. That time will also come. The other important thing to recognize is that we are dealing with uncertainty, not just in the short run, but also in the long run. When we are going to go into the post-COVID world, it will not be the case that we will be simply reflating the pre-COVID world. So the post-COVID world will have its own logic. It will have its own supply chains, its own geopolitics, its own technologies, its own consumer behavior. After all, after having gone through this huge shock, I don't think we will go back to behaving in exactly the same way we did back in February. I mean, for example, all of you are very used to using webinars right now. I mean, I have done a few webinars in the past, but now I am so, I do one of these every day. And we have all got used to doing office work or even events like this so frequently that I can see that, whether it's the academic world and teaching or meetings and all these will now routinely be done through webinar-based systems. And I'm sure now that this is such a large market, this process will get better and better and better. So, again, since we are not simply reflating the pre-COVID world, what kinds of policies can be put in place in order to do this? Well, one important thing that we know for sure is that this situation will have all kinds of unintended consequences. Well, by the definition, you can't predict them. They are unpredictable, they're unintended, and so on. So how do you create policies for that world? Well, one thing is that we know we have to be adaptable and flexible for that new environment. So if you look at the kinds of policies we are trying to put in place, they're very much about creating flexibility everywhere. So when we talk about Atmanirbhar Bharat is not about some sort of a return to import substitution of the Nehruvian years, as some people may have tried to interpret it. No, this Atmanirbharta is about resilience. It's about standing up and each economic agent being willing to adjust, adapt to an evolving situation. That is Atmanirbharta, being self-reliant at not just the national level, but even down to the individual, to the company level, to ministries and governments. Everybody has got to be flexible and adapt as we evolve through this. And if you see the kinds of measures we have put in place, we have done quite different kinds of measures as a result from what many other countries have done. So now that you have heard this kind of broader idea, you can see why we are responding the way we are on the economic front. First of all, other countries basically focused on one large demand package. We have not done that. We have decided to first cushion and then adapt step by step. So we have had mostly so far been giving you measures that are intended for cushioning. As we go into reflation, we will be putting into place more demand side measures, and we will do it step by step. We have some fiscal space. People think we have no fiscal space. That's not true. Our debt to GDP ratio is not as high as that of many other countries. So we do have some fiscal space and will be willing to use it. We have lots of monetary space as well. Unlike many countries with zero interest rates or even negative interest rates, Indian interest rates can still be lowered. The Reserve Bank has been lowering them. There is a transmission issue. We need to fix that. But there is space on the monetary and credit front, unlike in many other countries, for India to respond through monetary credit channels. So that will be utilized as well. But as I mentioned, we have also been focusing a lot on supply side measures. So while most countries have gone for this big bang demand measures, we have gone for a slightly different approach to demand, but we've also emphasized on supply side measures. And where are we looking at supply side measures? Well, a lot of it has got to do with being adaptable and flexible for this unpredictable post-COVID world. And so if you see where we have begun to do reforms, that's where they are. So give you an example. Let's take the getting rid of the Essential Commodities Act. Why did we do that? Well, because, you need to create a flexible agricultural market in this country. We, for reasons that are very difficult to fathom, quite frankly, maintained this peculiar system where farmers were told that you have to sell all your goods in a particular mandi. You had to sell there, you couldn't sell it anywhere else. Now, no other product is forced to do that. I mean, supposing I told you, said you produce cars and you can only sell your cars at a fixed price at a particular place, how would that go? I don't think you would have a healthy automobiles industry as a result of that. You wouldn't run any other industry. You wouldn't run a mobile phone industry in that way. Why are farmers being forced to sell their goods in the same place over and over again at fixed prices? Especially when, we showed you in the economic survey, there is no benefit to price stability as a result of this. We also had a peculiar system by which they used to have the people who used to buy and sell them, the traders. They would be raided every year under the name of price stability and be called hoarders. Frankly, why are they hoarders? They are storers. In an industry like agriculture, you have a bunching of production through harvests. And the only way you have stable prices is because people store them. Now, if you call those storers hoarders, why would they invest into storage? They wouldn't. And that's precisely what happened. So every year, the harvest, when there's good harvest or when there is a harvest, the prices would crash. And then a little bit later, they would, after a little while, it goes spiraling up. Now, countries that do not even grow onions, like Singapore or Dubai, have perfectly stable onion prices. But India, which produces such a lot of onions, has spiking prices. Why? Because nobody had the incentive of investing into storage. Why? Because if you did invest in storage, then you would have, every year somebody would come and raid you, inspectors would come and raid you, call you a hoarder, and you'd even get jailed for doing this. In fact, in 2019, you'll be surprised to hear, 76,000 raids were done against people in the name of hoarding under the Essential Commodities and APMC Acts. 76,000. And less than 2% of them stood up in court. So this is a pure case of harassment. And this was why our agriculture sector, the entire supply chain, simply wouldn't progress. And all of this was blamed on poor productivity of farmers and evidently price manipulation by so-called hoarders, where in fact what it was simply a poorly designed system where with large amounts of rent extraction by the petty officials on the ground. So what we have done is repealed or amended this Essential Commodities Act, and the APMC Acts are being changed in various ways at the state level. And that is a very major change that has been done just in the last 2 weeks. It's astounding that it hung around for so long, especially since the basis of this act, so just so that you know the history, the basis of the Essential Commodities Act and the APMC Acts actually lie in the agricultural policies of the East India Company, which had introduced similar kinds of acts in order to manipulate Indian agriculture to produce opium, raw cotton, and indigo for their own purposes. I'm shocked that after independent India, we did not get rid of what was clearly an extractive set of policies. So I just gave you that as an example, but there are other areas as well that we are introducing changes. We are beginning to change labor laws, for example. Some of the states have already begun doing major changes. But at the national level, we now need to have changes. We are doing that. We had some 44 central level labor laws plus numerous other provisions. They are all being consolidated into 4 codes. This is not to suggest that labor doesn't need labor laws and protection. It does. But it requires protection for safety. It requires protection for working conditions, where, by the way, we have very weak protection for them. Instead, what we are doing is we are increasing the provisions for safety and working conditions, while we are also increasing the flexibility for the labor market, so that people can be redeployed as we enter into new environments where new industries will emerge while old industries will decline. We have to be able to redeploy our labor force. And so flexibility is needed, and that has also been incorporated there. So one big area, labor flexibility. There are numerous other areas. We have also talked about what to do with our public sector. Here, as you may have heard, the finance minister having spoken about how the public sector will be divided up into strategic and non-strategic areas. A list is being drawn up. And in the non-strategic areas, we will essentially privatize these companies. And for the first time, you have a government which is quite clearly and unapologetically speaking about privatizing those parts of the government PSUs which are not strategic. There are areas, of course, where we will retain public sector enterprises. There are certain parts of finance, like parts of banking, where you do want some public sector presence. There is, defense, space, etc. But even there, more private sector participation is being opened up. Space has just been opened up, as you will know. And hopefully some of you who are being trained here and NITIE will go on to work in some of these institutions. So this is where we are at. And before ending, there is one area that I think would be specifically interesting to you. I think one area where we do badly and we should do better, and where this new way of thinking would particularly be pertinent, is in the fact that we need to begin to think in wider, non-siloed ways. Way too much of Indian academia, industry, and within even within each of them, they work in silos. So we have way too many people working in management who know nothing about industry and who don't know much about heavy engineering, for example, and so on and so forth. So I think we need to break down silos, and the institution you happen to be in has a great tradition, not just in management, but in heavy engineering industrial kind of research and teaching. And this is very important, that this tradition, that you cannot, for example, think of yourself, say, as just an IIM would think of itself, which does not attach to more engineering kind of heavy industry kind of background. The very fact that you're in industry, in an institution which has all these linkages, you happen to be in Mumbai, which has, of course, a big industrial base around it. You need to think of yourselves very differently than, for example, the average IIM. They have their own role, but you are not them. You should take advantage of the institution you are in. There is huge value for people who have direct linkages to industry and engineering in their institution. So please reach out to those parts of your institution. I haven't seen your curriculum, but I do hope that the curriculum that is taught in your institution breaks through silos and merges and mixes various different fields so that we are able to deal with this new post-COVID world in much more flexible way than we have historically dealt with new opportunities. With that, let me stop, and I'm happy to answer questions from the audience.
Well, that was very, very insightful. And thank you very much for addressing specifically the NITIE fraternity and, the role that NITIE can play in nation building. So I think that's something all our students needed to hear. So let me tell you that when we invite somebody like you who wears so many hats, we were drowned by an avalanche of questions. So we had to really, kind of parse and cut through. So I had predictably most of the questions from
Sorry, last bit, you broke up in the last bit, so
fan.
you'll have to repeat that.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, so I said this question, I'm certain, has come from somebody who's your fan. So this question is, how should we transform our Ashokan system of governance into a Kautilyan model of governance? This is the question.
Obviously, you have been reading much of my writings. So for those who do not understand what that question even means, let me give you a little bit of background and you will know. You see, India has, of course, a very old traditions of thinking about economics and social issues and governance. And there were many debates in the past. Some of these debates still go on. But one of the debates, which go back to Mauryan times, is about two approaches to thinking about what is the role of the state. And the way, or simple way of talking about it, is to think about the Ashokan approach and the Kautilyan approach. Now, the Kautilyan approach, which is, of course, that of the founder of the Mauryan Empire, was that the role of the state was very much about, first and foremost, about the rule of law. So he had a very much a Danda NITIE, that is the term used. The rule of law was the basis of society. Prosperity was an important part of what the state provided, but it was provided in terms of overall policy or regulation where necessary. For example, there were industries which the state clearly regulated, and taxation, defense, and so on and so forth. Now, this is a very different view of what the state's role is than, say, that of Ashoka. So if you read Ashoka's edicts, then you will read Ashoka presents himself as, he says in his edicts, I am the father to my people. He's very prescriptive. For example, he says, you will not eat meat on, so the third day of Tissa and the fourth day of Chaturmasi and so on. He's very, very prescriptive about how the individual lives of people will be led. And he's trying to be sort of like a paternalistic father figure to his people. Very different from the Chanakyan view, where it is a much more severe view at one level, in the sense that Chanakya's view is, the state as the arbiter of law and order. State provides defense, it provides taxation, it provides, coinage and monetary policy, and so on. But largely framework issues. Chanakya, for example, writes explicitly that he is not in favor of, say, things like prohibition, because that in his mind would be interfering in people's daily lives. Ashoka, on the other hand, would have no problem with that. I mean, he is very much about, interfering and telling people what to do. So he, for example, says, just like a mother hands over her child to a nanny, in the same way, I am handing over my people to my officials. He actually says this. And he also then goes and institutes a group of officials called the Dharma Mahamantas. Now, somebody who comes more from the Chanakyan view of this would consider it rather scandalous to have people who I would consider the religious police. But yet, despite the fact that, at least to me, Ashoka comes out as a rather pedantic, interfering kind of king, in the early years of after India became independent, it was Ashoka, not Chanakya, who was presented as the ideal. In fact, so you had the Ashokan ideal, of course, is not surprising, because that is precisely what the initial years the Nehruvian system wanted to be. It was all about the license permit Raj. The state had the right to tell you what to do, whereas the Chanakyan state is much more hands-off as far as these things are concerned. But on the other hand, it has no sense of humor as far as, for example, internal security is concerned. So there are two different visions of what um, the Indian state should be doing. I have, in my writings, have left nobody with any illusion about which way I swing. As I point out, let's remember that Chanakya or Kautilya, if you prefer, was the founder of the Mauryan Empire, whereas the empire collapsed while Ashoka was still alive.
That was quite an exciting answer for us. Most of us didn't disappoint us at all. So I'll just move on quickly to the next question. Is India planning to reduce the reliance of the budding startups on the foreign investment companies like Tiger Global, Tencent, etc.? And if yes, how? You want me to repeat?
So no. Of course, Atmanirbharta does not mean that we are closing ourselves to the rest of the world. It means that we have to be self-reliant. So on one hand, we do need to build up a domestic, venture capital industry so that we can use domestic capital to fund our startups. But at the same time, we do want foreign capital, technologies, linkages to be there for our startups. So this is not a matter of closing things up. However, it is the case that we will protect our industry in various ways. National interest will be taken into account. And where we feel that there may be a problem because we are uncomfortable with a certain kind of investment or with certain kinds of unfair practices, or there may be geostrategic reasons why we want to restrict certain things. In those situations, we will introduce those restrictions. But this is not a suggestion that we are somehow trying to create a 100% purity test on our startup industry. Not at all the case. Next question.
Yeah. So in the past decade, many Japanese companies have preferred to locate in Vietnam, Cambodia, Philippines, Thailand, and other smaller economies. So of course, you have spoken about better labor laws and, more policy-driven kind of initiatives. But what can we really expect? Can we expect more of?
So of course, the supply chains of the post-COVID world will be different from those before the COVID. And there is no question, and I think the Prime Minister has been absolutely clear on this, that we have to think seriously about participating in the post-COVID world, in the supply chains of the post-COVID world. And this fits into already things we were already doing, but we now need to do it even work harder at it, whether it is make in India, assemble in India, and various other projects. But we obviously need to encourage large international companies to relocate to India, and we are beginning to do that. There are many reasons for this. Some of course, may be purely geostrategic, but there are other reasons for it as well. I mean, there is resilience reasons for protecting certain parts of our industry for this. For example, we are a major supplier of generic drugs to the rest of the world. We do need to protect certain key ingredients for that industry and make sure that we have multiple sources of it. If not, where possible, we should be manufacturing them in India as well. So there are certain areas where we need to think strategically about all of this. This will also be true about the kinds of trade relationships we have with the rest of the world, where we will have to organize it such that we have both links to suppliers of key inputs, but also with key export markets. So everywhere we will reorient it where necessary so that we can participate with these things. And by the way, it's been appreciated globally. Just in the last few weeks, you would have seen some major announcements by companies to relocate facilities to India. So, and of course, I mean, this is not to say that the other countries are not doing this as well. And they are. And good luck to them. Many of them are our partners. So when things relocate there, there's also good for us because we have linkages with them. So we cannot think of this as a purely divide up the cake kind of way. There are things that we benefit in a two-way way with other countries. So, This is not to be thought of in a purely import substitution way. We are a part of a global supply chain. It means that we have to also think in terms of literally being a part of that chain.
So here is a question on geopolitics. So Indian Ocean is considered India's backyard, but with Chinese movement in the region of Djibouti, Hambantota and Gwadar, how do you feel India should work to secure its maritime sea lanes, and how will this transform the region for the years to come and maybe the entire 21st century?
Well, I'm not the right person to comment on a particular country's action, so I will ignore that part of the question. But I can say that it is the case that that the Indian Ocean is a part of our geostrategic area of geostrategic interest. Sadly, till very, very recently, just a few years ago, we tended not to think of our place in the world in maritime terms. This is strange given the very long maritime history that we have, but unfortunately we tended to think only in continental terms. So when you thought of India's neighbors, you always thought on one side we have Pakistan, on the other side we have China, and a few countries in between. But in fact, if you think in maritime terms, then we have other neighbors too. Australia is a Indian Ocean country. It's not just a Pacific country as we tended to think in the past. And we have begun to think of it as an Indian Ocean country. Our neighbors include Singapore and Indonesia and Oman and South Africa, countries with whom we have very close historical links and also current links. There are large Indian communities in some of these countries. And so by reorienting our thinking to a more maritime orientation, it certainly means that we can begin to think about many things we hadn't historically paid attention to.
So I have some questions on the direct cash benefit. So at least two questions. The current benefits of the relief package mostly focuses on providing direct cash benefits. Many state governments have also failed to act as guarantors as they themselves are constrained. What is your opinion on direct cash benefits?
So I think I made it very clear that we have used direct cash transfer. I can't comment on what states are doing because I'm the central government. I can only speak for the central government. It would be awkward for me to speak about what state governments are doing. But let me say that we did do fairly large sets of transfers starting in April. And millions of Jan-Dhan accounts have seen direct monies being transferred to them. So this system does work. And I think we have good feedback about it. Now, it is possible that there are still people who are falling through the cracks, and we do try very hard to try and bring those people onto the platform. But I think the JAM Trinity, the Jan-Dhan Aadhaar Mobile Trinity, has been a good platform for reaching out to very large numbers of people. Without this platform, it simply would not have been possible to reach out to this. Now, I would like to comment here that this approach has been to create safety nets. So whether it is in terms of the Ayushman Bharat, the medical insurance, that's a safety net. This kind of transfers we are doing, that's also cash, making sure there's basic cash going through to people. And now we're also using, obviously, a nationally mobile ration card that's coming, which will be put in place probably by March next year, so not too far from here. And of course, food guarantees that have been already put in place. So all of these are ways of providing cushioning in different ways. And it's deliberately done in different ways so that if people slip through one, they get caught by the other. And there are different ways of providing this. So it's a network of safety nets. It is not, by the way, the same idea as a universal basic income, which is a totally different idea. That is not what we are doing here. This is a safety net approach. It's not a universal basic income approach.
I think you made that pretty clear. I think people now have much more clarity on what is a cash transfer intended to realistically accomplish. So on a related note, one of the initiatives has been one ration card. which of course would have made the migrants' life very, very simple. But maybe standing from where we stand today, could there have been a good time to, or a good way to take care of the migrants and probably avoided the kind of...
So, as you know, decisions are made, as I told you, in an environment of extreme uncertainty, and you have to make trade-offs. If, for example, very large numbers of migrants had begun moving in the beginning, and let's say this pandemic turned out to be as dangerous as some of the more pessimistic approaches were in the beginning, then imagine what would have happened. I mean, we would have had millions of deaths happening as suddenly the huge numbers of migrants moved. As it happened to be, it was delayed, and it happened in dribs and drabs. We managed it to the extent we can. It's true that still meant that very large numbers of people were migrating in ways we wouldn't have liked them to be walking such large distances. But it happened in much slower way. It gave us some time, and it also allowed us some time to respond by putting in place the trains, etc. So the trains were put in place for allowing mass migration to be happen. And then after the initial sort of disruption, we did manage to think you don't see large migrants walking around anymore. That doesn't mean that Indian cities now don't have large migrant populations. They do. But now things have settled in. The economy is also open. Some of them have gone back to work and so on. So, in fact, as many of you will know, many migrants are now moving back to their place of work. So there's a back migration now beginning to happen as well. So I think given the sheer scale of what we were dealing with, I think we did a good job.
Yeah, so we realize the kind of constraints, probably unprecedented. So you made a very pertinent observation for NITIE as an institution, that we can't function in silos. And we need to really look out at cross-pollinations and meaningful collaborations. So on a similar vein, what kind of advice you have for the NITIE students who are current students, who have just graduated, who have moved into a world of vast uncertainty? What are your words of wisdom?
Well, let me say that all worlds of vast uncertainty are also worlds of vast opportunity. We should think of ourselves as people who are entering where many of the older rules do not apply. So this is an environment for risk taking, and you are, some of those who have just gone out and graduated, or will do in a year or so. You will be entering a new world, and you will be making that new world. As people like myself will be transitioning out. We will be the oldies of that system. So I think this new world, which will probably fall in place over the next decade or two. So don't think in quarters and so on. You've got to think in years in that environment, because the disruption you've just gone through has to be thought in those terms. The last time such a disruption happened, as I mentioned, was after the Great Depression and the Second World War. What happened? Let's go back and look at that world. Remember, colonial empires collapsed. India became independent. Many of the world's architecture, whether it's the World Bank, IMF, UN, all of these institutions were created in that environment. So the world that you inherited was created in those, very late 40s, early 50s. And they lasted us till now. Now that we are going to enter this, many, many other things will happen. Some of these institutions may not even survive that transition, or will very radically be changed. I mean, you have already seen what's happening with WHO and the US pulling out and so on. So do not assume the logic of the previous pre-COVID world will hold in the post-COVID world. This will be true also for technology. As I said, the way universities function may be fundamentally changed. I mean, take, for example, classes that are happening. Why, if you're going to do online classes, why pay high fees for Harvard? And you can watch many of the same professors giving the same lectures on YouTube. Why would you pay very, very high fees to go to Harvard? I don't know. Maybe some of you will, because the stamp is good, but is it worth $45,000 a year? But then if you're moving on to a different kind of education, what will it be? what will be the signaling mechanisms of that word for quality, and so on. I don't know the answers to all those questions. I'm just pointing out to you that they will be very, very, very different from what we have. But one thing I will tell you, which will not change because it hasn't ever changed in thousands of years, which is that if you take up a hard subject and delve into the nuts and bolts of it, there is something to be said about really understanding the difficult stuff. Too much of management education, unfortunately, has been about becoming good at PowerPoint. And in the longer run, that will not get you too far. There is eventually, in the longer run, quality does show through. So do take the time to learn the nuts and bolts of whatever it is in the world you want to do. If you want to get into technology, well, I'm sorry, you have to learn how to code and know about the latest technologies. You have to know. If you want to get into artificial intelligence, you really have to get into robotics and all the other complex stuff that goes in there. Or if you want to be a writer, you really have, just like you really have to know the language that you are going to write in. You have to be a reader in order to be a writer. So same thing is true. If you want to go into finance, you really have to go and spend some time on a trading floor in a financial market. There's no point in just being a journalist and writing about it. You have to sit on a trading floor. There's no way you will learn about how to function in a financial market until you have lost a significant amount of money. So that is also true for every other kind of thing you will do. So and I hope that NITIE, by the way, puts emphasis on bringing speakers from industry and diverse fields to speak to you in your school. But I also hope they have other departments come and speak about the cutting edge things that are happening in other departments in your institution to tell you what is the cutting edge that are happening, because that is really what will strive you, how you will shine.
Yeah, so a lot of my colleagues are also listening to you. I think as academicians, we can't agree more with what you have said. So we are left with a lot more questions, but I think we cannot reasonably demand more slice of your time. So unfortunately, I think I'll have to bring this segment to a close. I would like to invite our director, Professor Manoj Tiwari, to speak a few words.
Sanjeev ji, namaskar.
Namaskar.
So now
your institution looks so beautiful here, so I hope I can come and physically see it one day.
I just want to say that from very core of our heart, we are really thanking you for coming to our students platform. So simply using all the complex terms of the economy, demand, supply, and vertical world situation. Really, it's only you can do, not us, because we have no such great command over the words like you. So thank you very much, Sanjeev ji, for coming to our platform.
So we will now have a formal vote of thanks proposed by Professor.
I would like to thank Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal sir. Could see more than 250 students have participated. In this occasion, I would also like to thank our director, Professor Manoj K. Tiwari. Then I must mention the name of Professor Himadate Madam, who is Dean Student Affairs. She and her team, which includes me also, Mr. Sudri, we are trying to offer the best to the student in a difficult situation like this. So their learning, their knowledge gathering process cannot stop. It cannot be in pause. So we are trying our best. And all these are happening under the leadership of Professor Himadate Madam, who is Dean Student Affairs. Thank you to you, Madam, also. In today's function, Professor K.S. Ranjini, my colleague, has managed it beautifully. So my thanks to all my faculty colleagues. And last but not the least is my students. This program has been conducted by PMG, Prerana Management Group, a forum of the MBA students. At the end, finally, I would also like to thank the technology and the creators and the providers of technology who have made this possible. They are not visible here, but definitely they have done a great job. So with this, actually, I would once again like to thank Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal for having delivered this lecture today. This is our first 2022 lecture for the students. I'm sure many more lectures will be organized in future. Students call it fondly God's own campus. So please come here and enlighten us. Thank you all. Thank you.